I'm in Haifa right now. Behind me, what you see are the three ports in the city of Haifa. The red one at the back there, that is the Chinese port. And the Chinese port you'll see is just outwards into the sea. It's not going a lot into the landmass, which shows the distrust that the Israelis have of the Chinese. There have already been reports of espionage incidents by the Chinese, and therefore there is a lot of, strategic hedge that the Israelis have done. As far as the Adani port is concerned, that's the blue one in the middle, goes right into the mainland. It's one of the biggest ports in Haifa as of now. And the third one right in front here is the Israeli port, which is a relatively smaller port, but the biggest one being the Adani port. And that is, of course, 70% owned by India's Adani and the balance 30% by an Israeli company called Gedot. And this is the strategic investment that India and in the form of Adani Group has made in Israel. This is the hedge and the bet that Israel has taken on India. They want to develop this port, the port of Haifa, as one of the main conduits, a strategic route for energy. Given the blockades in Hormuz, they want to reduce the dependency in Hormuz. And a lot of Gulf countries have already started looking at the port of Haifa as the main transit point from the Mediterranean Sea, of course, into Europe. And that place is this. This is in Haifa in northern Israel.
3 years ago, when the Adani Group paid nearly $1.2 billion for a majority stake in Israel's Haifa port, many saw it as an expensive overseas acquisition, a bold business move, perhaps even an overpayment. Today, it is beginning to look like something very different. A strategic bet that may have anticipated one of the biggest geopolitical shifts of our time. Because look at what has happened. The Strait of Hormuz has repeatedly come under threat. The Red Sea has become a conflict zone. The Suez Canal route has faced disruptions. And global shipping is discovering a painful truth. A handful of maritime choke points can hold world trade hostage. So did India quietly secure one of the most important gateways to Europe before the world realized it would need one? And could Haifa port become a critical piece of India's long-term strategy to compete with China and reshape trade routes between Asia and Europe? Let's start with geography. Haifa sits on Israel's Mediterranean coast. It is one of the busiest ports of the eastern Mediterranean and offers direct maritime access to European markets. For India, that alone makes it valuable. But there is also history. Many Indians may not realize this, but Haifa occupies a special place in India's military legacy. In 1918, Indian cavalry units played a decisive role in liberating the city during the famous Battle of Haifa. More than a century later, India has returned to Haifa in a very different way, not with soldiers, but with investments. When Adani Port acquired a 70% stake in Haifa Port in 2023, Israeli media described it as a strategic purchase. Some reports suggested that the price paid was significantly above competing bids. Why? Because this was never just about containers and cargo. It was about access and influence and positioning India inside one of the world's most important trade crossroads. Remember, Adani Port already handles roughly a quarter of India's maritime commerce. Haifa was its first major overseas strategic acquisition and potentially the first building block of a logistics network stretching from India to Europe. Now let's talk about the bigger vision, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC. You've probably heard the term, but what exactly is it? Well, think of IMEC as an alternative trade highway, a route designed to connect India to Europe through the Gulf and the Middle East. Goods would leave Indian ports, travel to the UAE, move by rail across Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and then reach Europe through one critical Mediterranean gateway. And that gateway could be Haifa. Without Haifa, IMEC doesn't really work. Haifa is the bridge that connects the Middle East segment of the corridor to Europe. which is why the port is so strategically important. The vision is ambitious: reduce dependence on the Suez Canal, create faster supply chains, diversify trade routes, and most importantly, build an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. China, in fact, has spent more than a decade building infrastructure and influence across Eurasia. IMEC is effectively a competing model, one where India becomes a central node. The project is still, of course, evolving, but progress is reported. Earlier this year, Adani Ports signed a strategic agreement with France's Marseille-Fos port. The goal? To strengthen connectivity and create what is being called an IMEC Ports Club. At the same time, India's massive Vadhavan port project is being developed on the west coast. If Vadhavan becomes the eastern anchor and Marseille the western anchor, then Haifa becomes the pivot connecting the two. That is why many analysts increasingly see Haifa as far more than just a commercial port. It is a geopolitical asset. But let's not romanticize this too much, because Haifa comes with risks, big risks. The port sits in one of the most volatile regions on earth. The recent Iran-Israel conflict exposed exactly how vulnerable the region can be. Iranian missiles attacks forced Israel's largest refinery at Haifa to suspend operations. Markets reacted immediately. Adani Ports shares fell sharply as investors worried about the conflict's impact. Then came attacks by Iran-backed groups across the region. Transport routes suddenly looked far less predictable. The rail links that IMEC depends upon suddenly appeared very vulnerable. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Could IMEC face the same fate as another ambitious Indian connectivity project? Chabahar in Iran. Remember that story. India invested heavily in Chabahar to bypass Pakistan and access Central Asia. Then came sanctions, geopolitical tensions, war, and years of delays. Today, Chabahar remains important, but had never fully achieved the transformative role many originally imagined. Haifa and IMEC face similar uncertainties, but there's a difference. Despite the conflict, Haifa port keeps operating, cargo keeps moving, and Israel worked aggressively to ensure continuity at critical infrastructure facilities. And that resilience matters because investors and governments don't just look at peace, they look at whether trade can continue during a crisis. What's fascinating is that India isn't putting all its eggs in one basket. New Delhi is hedging simultaneously. It continues investing in Chabahar. It is expanding partnerships with Oman for including the Dukam and Salalah ports. It recently signed a landmark trade agreement with Oman, and it continues backing the IMEC, of course. Why? Because modern trade strategy is no longer about finding one perfect route. It is about creating multiple routes. Redundancy is the new security. If one corridor gets disrupted, another remains available. And that is exactly what India appears to be building. A network, not a single pathway. Now step back a little and look at the larger picture. India is negotiating deeper economic integration with Europe. It has signed a trade deal with the United Kingdom. It is pursuing major partnerships across Scandinavia. It is expanding cooperation on critical minerals, defense manufacturing, semiconductors, clean energy. All of that requires something fundamental: connectivity. Trade agreements are only as useful as the routes that support them. And that is where Haifa enters the story. The investment was never just about port revenues or shipping fees or cargo volumes. It was about securing a place for India at one of the gateways connecting Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. For years, China, of course, expanded its BRI footprint across continents. India's response is taking shape more slowly, but it is becoming increasingly visible through ports, trade corridors, strategic partnerships, and infrastructure investments, which is why Haifa is ultimately much bigger than a port. It is a statement about where India wants to be in the next phase of global trade. not simply using the routes built by others, but helping shape them. This is Times Access, where global stories meet India's perspective. Click on the bell icon to subscribe because the next big global shift will have India at its center.